They called her the Big E, but to the men who fought beneath her decks, the name carried less pride than superstition. She was the ship that kept coming back, scarred, battered, listed by explosions that should have sent her under, and yet each time the smoke cleared, she was still there, turning into the wind, launching planes that Japan swore had already been destroyed. When the Pacific War began, the USS Enterprise was just one carrier among several in the U.S. fleet. By the time it ended, she had become a legend whispered across both oceans, a ship that seemed to possess a life beyond steel, an endurance that defied logic. Japanese pilots learned her outline from reconnaissance photos, the dark flight deck, the twin forward elevators, the subtle bulge in her island structure. They studied her because they feared her. Every time they thought they had sunk her, she reappeared somewhere else, her planes striking again. December 7, 1941, began with silence off Oahu. Enterprise was at sea, returning from a routine mission to deliver aircraft to Wake Island. She was supposed to anchor at Pearl Harbor the night before, but heavy seas delayed her. That delay saved her from destruction. As Japanese torpedoes ripped through Battleship Row, Enterprise was still hundreds of miles away, catching faint radio fragments that made no sense at first. Words like air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill. Within hours, she changed course toward the smoke. Her aircraft became some of the first American planes to strike back that day. The Pacific Fleet was shattered, but Enterprise remained afloat, ready to fight. She became the center of a new kind of warfare, one that no admiral fully understood yet. Battleships lay in ruins. Aircraft carriers would now decide the outcome of the ocean war. The Enterprise's crew understood that in the simplest, hardest way, there was no one else left. Her first months of combat were a blur of motion and uncertainty. Raids on the Marshalls, Wake, and Marcus Islands tested her air groups in lightning strikes that came and vanished before the enemy could react. The Japanese command began referring to her as the Gray Ghost. Intelligence officers marked her supposed destruction more than once, only to have new reports confirm her survival. Each return to Pearl Harbor found her scarred, patched, and rearmed, with fresh crews replacing those who had fallen. By early 1942, the U.S. Navy had just 3 carriers in the Pacific capable of offensive action: Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet. Together they formed Task Force 16, a floating fragment of American power facing an empire that stretched from Burma to the Aleutians. When Hornet launched Jimmy Doolittle's raiders in April, Enterprise's fighters guarded her, turning back probing Japanese patrol planes. The strike achieved little militarily, but it stunned Tokyo and altered Japan's plans. Those plans converged on a name that would become synonymous with chance and reversal: Midway. Enterprise's pilots trained without rest, learning to launch in minutes, to find targets by instinct across hundreds of miles of empty sea. Her deck crews drilled in silence at night, moving aircraft with red-shielded lamps, their hands blackened by fuel and oil. They did not know that the coming battle would decide the Pacific. They only knew the ocean around them had become a hunting ground where every shadow might hide another carrier. When the Japanese fleet advanced on Midway in June 1942, it was Enterprise that launched first. Her scouts found the enemy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, just as the morning sun broke the horizon. The dive bombers of Bombing Squadron 6 went in through curtains of flak, engines howling in near-vertical dives. One by one, their bombs struck home. In minutes, the pride of the Imperial Navy was aflame. From the decks of the surviving Japanese ships, men watched pillars of smoke coil into the sky. They did not yet know which American carrier had found them, but soon radio intercepts told them, Enterprise, again. She had become a symbol, a recurring nightmare. When her planes returned, many never came back. Half of her air group lost or damaged, but the enemy's heart had been pierced. Midway changed the course of the war, and the Enterprise had been at its center. In the months that followed, she fought at Guadalcanal, where the ocean itself seemed cursed. Here, the Big E's luck would be tested beyond imagination. Night after night, Japanese bombers came in low, guided by moonlight on the waves. They struck again and again, hammering her decks, starting fires that turned her corridors into tunnels of smoke. Crewmen carried the wounded through knee-deep water as flames licked the bulkheads. One officer wrote later that he had felt the ship tremble, not from fear, but from fury. Even crippled, she kept her engines turning. Her flight deck sagged, her elevators jammed, her crew exhausted. But before dawn, they were launching planes again. When she limped back into Pearl Harbor, sailors from every dockyard stopped to watch her enter. Her sides were torn, her paint scorched to bare steel, yet she moved under her own power. Some swore they saw her bow dip slightly, as if in salute to the ghosts of the ship still lying on the harbor floor. The Japanese believed no ship could survive what Enterprise had endured. Intelligence bulletins listed her as possibly sunk no fewer than 3 times that year. Each time, within weeks, American planes from a carrier believed to be Enterprise appeared somewhere new, over the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, reminding them that she was still out there, somewhere, turning into the wind once more. To her crew, she was more than a ship. She was a refuge, a constant. When men transferred off, they would later write of her as if leaving behind a living thing, something that breathed and remembered. Her logbooks recorded fuel and ordnance, but never the quiet moments, the hum of the hangar deck after an attack, the sound of rain falling through holes burned in the flight deck, the hush before the next launch order. The enemy tried to erase her again at Santa Cruz in October 1942. Waves of torpedo bombers found her, diving through anti-aircraft fire so thick it turned the air white. 2 torpedoes struck home. The ship heaved, then righted herself. Her damage reports read like eulogies, holes large enough to drive trucks through, fires reaching the gallery deck, scores of men dead or missing. Yet her engines still turned, her rudder still answered. Japan's radio claimed another victory. An American carrier sunk, they announced. The Imperial Navy cheered. But within days, the truth filtered through intercepted signals. Enterprise was under repair and returning to action. In late 1942, the Pacific was a graveyard of ambitions. Ships vanished in flame and spray. Whole squadrons disappeared into the sea without a trace. For the men aboard Enterprise, survival had become a habit, not a guarantee. The carrier's very name had begun to feel defiant, a promise written in steel against an ocean that devoured everything it touched. Her flight deck bore the scars of every engagement. Patches of new timber shone against old bullet holes sealed with molten metal. The scent of oil and cordite never left her decks. Sailors joked grimly that she had been sunk more times than any ship afloat. But below the jokes was pride, hard and private. Every patch welded, every cable replaced was proof that the Big E was still alive, and that they were still fighting. By January 1943, Enterprise was the only operational American carrier left in the Pacific. The others were at the bottom of the sea or in dry dock thousands of miles away. She carried the weight of a fleet on her deck. Task Force 16 had been reduced to her and a handful of escorts. The Japanese, still formidable, believed one final blow would sweep the Americans from the South Pacific. But that blow never came. Enterprise was already on her way back into the Solomons, her air groups refitted, her decks painted over, her patched hull gleaming under the equatorial sun. To the enemy, she was a phantom. Japanese reconnaissance pilots often reported sighting her when she wasn't there at all, a superstition taking form in the minds of men who had watched her survive the impossible. When Japanese intelligence broadcasts announced her destruction after Santa Cruz, morale soared for a day, until new American raids appeared from a large carrier believed to be Enterprise. The illusion of invincibility had turned into a weapon. At Guadalcanal, Enterprise's planes fought above a volcanic island littered with wrecks and jungle smoke. Her flyers had learned the art of the sudden strike, diving through cloud cover, hitting fuel dumps and runways, vanishing into rain squalls before enemy fighters could climb to meet them. The men below heard her aircraft as a low, growing rumble that preceded disaster. The Japanese called her the ship that fights even when sunk. For the sailors aboard, the days were defined by sound. The thunder of engines warming before dawn, the scream of catapults, the rattle of anti-aircraft batteries when alarms sounded. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the bark of general quarters. They moved through smoke and heat as if through weather, never knowing when the next attack would come. When she returned to Pearl Harbor in the spring of 1943, the men of the docks greeted her like a relic that refused to die. Shipfitters traced the outlines of bomb craters in her deck with disbelief. A yard worker wrote in his diary, "Everywhere you touch her, she's patched, and yet she fights like new." The ship's chaplain called her survival a matter of faith-made metal. Behind the statistics, the sorties flown, the tonnage sunk, was something quieter. Enterprise had become a ritual. Each takeoff and landing carried the memory of those who hadn't returned. The ship's crew kept their names on small cards tacked inside lockers or folded into prayer books. It wasn't sentimentality. It was continuity. On a ship where everything could vanish in a heartbeat, memory was an act of resistance. That summer, the Enterprise joined the push toward the Central Pacific. The battles of Tarawa and Macon tested a new doctrine: overwhelming carrier power. For the first time, she sailed in company with newly built carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Yorktown II. To the young crews of those fresh ships, Enterprise was an artifact from another age, smaller and darker, her fittings worn smooth by salt and smoke. But she moved with the authority of a veteran. The fleet learned from her. Pilots who flew from her deck spoke of the strange calm that hung over her launches, as if the ship herself lent them composure. From above, her outline was unmistakable. Japanese spotters recognized her almost instantly and called her out over the radio. "Kantai Tekiken, Enterprise!" The call meant danger. She had become the measure by which all other American carriers were judged. When her planes appeared, the enemy expected precision, speed, and persistence. During the Gilbert's campaign in late 1943, the Japanese threw everything they had at her: bombers, torpedoes, kamikaze-style dives long before the tactic had a name. Yet again she survived. A torpedo missed her bow by less than 50 yards. A 500-pound bomb struck her deck, detonated, and blew a crater through to the hangar. Yet within hours, flight operations resumed. Damage control parties had become artists, moving through smoke with tools wrapped in wet rags, hammering patches in place while the air still shimmered with heat. One of them, a bosun named Delaney, later recalled, "You could hear her groan sometimes. It was like she was talking to you, not breaking, but complaining. Like she wanted to stay in the fight but needed you to help her do it." By 1944, Enterprise had earned more battle stars than any ship afloat. Yet she carried them without ceremony. Her paint had faded to a dull gray, streaked with rust, her decks uneven from years of pounding. The Navy might have retired her, but the war would not allow it. Newer ships were still joining the fleet, but none had her reputation. She was sent forward again and again: Truk, the Marshalls, the Carolines, striking deeper into the empire that had once ruled the Pacific. Unchallenged. Japanese propagandists began referring to her with grim admiration. In Tokyo newspapers, her name appeared alongside phrases like the unsinkable American carrier. For the sailors of the Imperial Navy, it was half insult, half myth. They joked that Enterprise was protected by American ghosts, that every bomb dropped on her passed harmlessly through. But there was nothing supernatural about her endurance. It was discipline, repetition, and the collective will of thousands of men who refused to let their ship die. The Big E's survival was the sum of small, ordinary acts: hoses dragged through flame, bulkheads sealed in darkness, flight crews guiding crippled aircraft to deck-edge landings by the glow of burning oil. She fought at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, launching wave after wave of fighters into what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Enterprise's pilots tore through Japanese formations with precision born of exhaustion. By nightfall, hundreds of enemy planes had been destroyed. When the final tallies came in, the magnitude of the victory barely registered aboard. They were too tired, too aware that every triumph only led to the next operation. After that, the Japanese air arm was broken. But Enterprise still had one more gauntlet to face: the return to the Philippines, where the skies would fill again with men who intended not to return from their missions. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific had changed color. The once limitless blue that stretched from Hawaii to the Philippines was now scarred by oil slicks and wreckage. Every horizon seemed haunted by smoke. The Enterprise, older than most of the men aboard her, moved through that landscape like a survivor among ghosts. She had become both symbol and target. To the Japanese, the American advance felt endless, its spear point carried by carriers that appeared without warning, struck with impossible coordination, and vanished beyond pursuit. Among those carriers, none drew the enemy's attention like Enterprise. Her record had become legend even in Tokyo. Each new assault was planned with the hope, almost the obsession, of finding and finally sinking her. As the fleet steamed toward Leyte Gulf, her decks were a choreography of preparation. Ordnance crews rolled bombs on dollies between lines of waiting aircraft. Fuel lines hissed softly. The smell of gasoline mixed with the salty wind, and the deck plates trembled with the heartbeat of her engines. The Big E was once again at the front. October 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, would test every skill her crew had learned since Pearl Harbor. Enterprise's air groups launched at dawn, striking enemy convoys and cruisers that tried to cut off the landings. Her fighters tangled with waves of Japanese aircraft over the Philippines, weaving among tracer streams so dense that the sky seemed made of burning wire. It was here that a new weapon revealed itself. For months, intelligence officers had intercepted reports of pilots who did not return, who seemed to fly deliberately into American ships. At first, the stories sounded like rumor or madness, but as Leyte unfolded, the truth became visible. Pilots, young, barely trained, dived their aircraft directly into the targets below. The kamikaze had arrived. On the morning of October 25th, one of them found Enterprise. The ship's radar picked up the incoming wave, but there was little time. Gunners opened up, filling the air with bursts of black smoke. Through the chaos, a single Zero broke through. It came in low over the bow, trailing flame. Men shouted warnings. The plane struck the flight deck just aft of the island, exploding in a fountain of burning fuel. For a moment, the ship disappeared inside its own smoke. Fire roared through the forward section. Men ran with hoses, axes, extinguishers, anything that could stop the spreading inferno. Aircraft loaded with fuel and bombs threatened to ignite in chain reaction. Damage control teams crawled beneath the deck to cut cables and flood compartments. The air grew so hot that paint blistered off the walls. Within an hour, the fires were under control. The Big E emerged, scarred but alive once more. The crew counted their dead, patched the deck, and began preparing new planes for launch. By evening, she was flying sorties again. The Japanese pilots who had watched her burn from above assumed she was finished. When she returned to action the next day, they refused to believe it. The kamikaze campaign intensified through November. Enterprise's anti-aircraft gunners learned to track incoming dives by instinct alone. Each man knew that one hit could erase the ship they had kept alive for 3 years. The sky was a storm of noise, 5-inch guns hammering, shells bursting, tracers arcing upward. The enemy seemed endless, yet every attack that failed left the ship stronger in the eyes of her crew. She had beaten back death so many times that even fear began to change form. It became resolve. Among the crew, there was a phrase passed quietly from watch to watch. The Big E doesn't go down. It wasn't said with bravado. It was said as fact, like a law of physics. Men believed it because they had seen it proven. By December, Enterprise was back in Ulithi for repairs. The dry dock workers climbed her hull in silence. They saw the black streaks running down her sides, the warped plating around the flight deck, the fragments of aircraft still embedded in her catwalks. Yet once again her essential structure was intact. Her bones were unbroken. One worker wrote home, "If ships have souls, this one's got a stubborn one." But the war was not finished with her. The next phase would bring her to the very edge of Japan and to the most violent months of her life. In the first months of 1945, Enterprise joined Task Force 58 in the assault on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She was no longer the largest carrier in the fleet, nor the newest. Around her sailed gleaming Essex-class giants, their decks lined with fresh-painted aircraft, their crews younger, their engines stronger. But when the task force commander needed a ship to take the lead, to absorb the first blow, the order was the same: Enterprise. She sailed north into weather that seemed alive with malice. The sea turned black with rain and spray, the wind howling across her flight deck as she launched pre-dawn strikes toward Iwo Jima. Her planes covered the Marines below, strafing pillboxes and artillery hidden among volcanic ridges. For days she flew without rest. When pilots returned, they landed through smoke and debris, their aircraft riddled with holes. The deck crew worked in silence, guiding them down through the chaos, rearming, refueling, sending them out again. The men of the Imperial Navy who survived those raids began to use her name in prayer and in anger. Enterprise, one Japanese report read, continues to attack without pause. Her endurance defies destruction. Another intercepted message simply said, "We thought she had been sunk. She fights again." By April, the carrier approached Okinawa, the final crucible. The Japanese had concentrated thousands of aircraft for one last desperate onslaught. Enterprise took her place among the picket line, launching fighters around the clock to intercept attackers before they reached the invasion fleet. On April 11th, the first waves came. Over 200 aircraft swept toward the fleet. Enterprise's fighters met them at distance, but some broke through. One kamikaze dove directly for her stern. Gunners hit it repeatedly, but momentum carried the burning plane forward. It struck near the aft elevator, detonating a 250-kilogram bomb. The blast tore a crater in the flight deck and hurled men into the air. Fires erupted across the hangar. For hours, the ship fought for her life. Smoke rose in a column visible for miles. Yet again, she endured. Her damage control teams, some veterans of every major battle since 1942, sealed compartments, fought flames, and saved her. She limped away under her own power. The Japanese radio claimed her destruction once more. The American carrier Enterprise has been sunk, they declared. But within 10 days, reconnaissance photos proved otherwise. There she was again, patched, operational, her planes striking Kyushu. The legend deepened. Each time she survived, the belief grew among her crew that she could not die. It was not arrogance, but familiarity with the impossible. When the next attack came, another suicide dive, another explosion, they simply fought through it. Her decks had been patched so often that they looked like a mosaic of past battles. Her hull bore the story of the entire Pacific War, written in steel and fire. By May 1945, Enterprise had fought in more major engagements than any ship in history. Her decks were pitted and scarred, her radar arrays twisted, her elevators temperamental. Yet she remained in line, her air group still launching sorties over Okinawa, her gunners still watching the sky for the next shadow descending out of the sun. The Big E had outlasted them all, the Yorktown, the Hornet, the Lexington, the Wasp. She had survived storms, torpedoes, bombs, and suicide attacks. In the words of one officer, she has been pronounced dead so many times that death no longer knows her name. By late April 1945, the Pacific had become a furnace. Off Okinawa, the ocean was a field of drifting wreckage, burning ships, twisted aircraft, floating fragments of uniforms and timber. The suicide attacks came without pattern or pause. Sometimes a lone plane dove at dusk, its wings aflame. Sometimes dozens came together, blotting out the sky. Every ship in the fleet was scarred. But for the men aboard Enterprise, the storm felt personal. It seemed the enemy wanted her above all others. Her radar screens pulsed constantly, filled with echoes of incoming aircraft. The gunners never stood down. Ammunition hoists ran day and night. The flight deck was streaked with soot, its patched planks still warm from the last attack. Even when the air was clear, the men moved as if expecting the next alarm. They had learned to read silence as warning. On May 14th, the pattern changed. The morning began calm, with scattered clouds and gentle swells. Enterprise launched her first strike of the day, fighters and bombers heading toward Kyushu. By midday, the returning planes began to circle for recovery. The crew was exhausted but alert. The war seemed close to ending, yet death hovered above the horizon. At 6:15 p.m., radar picked up a small contact approaching from the northwest. It looked insignificant, just another blip among hundreds. But within minutes, the object resolved into a single Japanese Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, descending through cloud at tremendous speed. Gunners opened fire. Tracers clawed upward, catching the sunlight like threads of fire. The bomber wobbled, burning, but it did not break. It came in low over the bow, engines screaming. The impact was instant. An explosion near the forward elevator, the detonation of its bomb penetrating deep into the ship's interior. The blast tore through compartments, blew open bulkheads, and sent a column of flame shooting skyward. Men were hurled from the deck. The elevator platform vanished, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the hangar below. For an instant, the ship seemed to shudder to a halt, as if the ocean itself had seized her. Then she moved again. Pumps roared to life. Fire crews charged into the inferno, their faces blackened by soot and oil. Inside the hangar, fuel lines ruptured, igniting new fires. Planes exploded in sequence, each blast shaking the ship like an earthquake. Smoke filled the passageways. Some men fought blind, crawling along the deck by touch alone, guided by the heat of the flames. The ship's captain, Matt Sherman, refused to abandon the bridge. He ordered counterflooding to correct the list, dispatched repair crews to the lower decks, and kept the engines turning. Through the chaos, the ship's loudspeakers crackled with a single command repeated over and over: "Keep her alive." It took 7 hours to bring the fires under control. When dawn broke, the scene was apocalyptic. The forward third of the flight deck was gone, the elevator twisted and hanging over open water. The steel beneath had buckled from heat. Bodies lay shrouded along the catwalks, yet below decks the engines still hummed. Enterprise was crippled, but alive. The fleet tugs moved alongside, their crews staring in disbelief at what remained of the most famous ship in the Pacific. From a distance, she looked finished, her bow half consumed by smoke, her deck sagging, her island scorched. Japanese radio announced her destruction once again. Tokyo newspapers printed triumphant headlines: "The Big E sinks beneath the waves." But the reports were premature, as always. Enterprise refused to die. She was towed to Ulithi, then on to Pearl Harbor. There, repair crews swarmed over her wounds. They found her internal structure remarkably intact. The explosion that should have broken her spine had missed by inches. Her hull had flexed, not fractured. "If she had been any other carrier," one engineer wrote, "we'd be salvaging her parts." The repairs began, but the war was moving faster than steel could be replaced. Japan was collapsing. B-29s burned Tokyo by night. American fleets surrounded the home islands. Enterprise's crew, scattered across dockyards and barracks, listened to radio reports of the final battles they would not fight. When word of Germany's surrender reached Pearl, they cheered. But when news came of the atomic bombings, the celebration was subdued. Many of the men who had kept her alive felt only emptiness. They had spent years fighting to reach Japan. Now, the war had ended without them. Enterprise was still in dry dock when the official announcement came, August 15, 1945. Japan had surrendered. Across the base, sirens wailed not in alarm but in triumph. Sailors climbed the scaffolds and cheered. Some wept. On the decks of the Big E, flags unfurled in the warm Pacific wind. The war was over, but for Enterprise, the story did not end in peace. In November, she was chosen to bring the first waves of veterans home. Her decks, once blackened by fire, were scrubbed and repainted. Bunks filled her hangars where bomb racks had been. Thousands of men boarded her, soldiers, sailors, Marines, returning from islands whose names would never leave them. They called it Operation Magic Carpet. For many, stepping aboard the Big E felt like boarding history itself. The old ship crossed the Pacific once more, carrying the living ghosts of the war she had survived. Her corridors echoed with laughter again, with songs and card games and the clatter of mess trays instead of the wail of alarms. Yet beneath the surface was something solemn, a collective understanding that they were the last chapter of a story written in blood and flame. When she steamed under the Golden Gate Bridge in December 1945, San Francisco erupted in celebration. Whistles, sirens, crowds on the piers waving flags. Enterprise passed beneath the bridge slowly, her gray hull glinting in the sunlight. Her crew lined the rails in dress whites. For the first time in years, there was no smoke above her deck. Reporters called her the ship that refused to sink. Admiral Nimitz called her the most decorated ship of World War II. But to the men aboard, those words seemed too small. She had been their world, their shield, their home. They knew what she had cost to keep afloat. When the crowds dispersed and the ship tied up at Alameda, silence settled over her decks. The Big E had nowhere left to go. She had outlived the war, and in peacetime, there was no need for a legend. In early 1946, she was ordered to Bremerton, Washington for decommissioning. The orders read like a eulogy disguised as paperwork. Men packed their lockers, carried duffels down gangways they had once raced across under fire. On February 17, 1947, the USS Enterprise was formally decommissioned. Her colors were struck, her engines silenced. In the quiet that followed, a handful of officers remained aboard to oversee her final inspection. They walked her empty passageways, listening to the faint echoes of their own footsteps. The ship smelled of oil and dust, the air heavy with memory. One of them later wrote, "You could almost hear her breathe. She wasn't dead, just waiting." Waiting for what? No one could say. The war had ended, but for the Enterprise, peace brought no sanctuary. Her decks were quiet now, the hum of engines replaced by the whisper of wind through open hatches. Paint peeled along her catwalks. The smell of salt and rust hung in the air. The crew that had once filled her with life was gone, scattered to cities and towns across the country, trying to remember how to live without the rhythm of general quarters or the tremor of distant guns. For a while there were plans. Admirals spoke of turning her into a floating museum, a monument to the carrier war she had embodied. Cities competed to host her: New York, San Francisco, Washington. Veterans groups sent letters, collected donations, organized petitions. They called her the Gray Ghost of the Pacific, a relic that should be preserved not for sentiment but for memory. But the war had left behind too many ships, too much steel. The Navy's budget shrank. New carriers, the Midway class, vast and modern, were already at sea. Enterprise was old, expensive to maintain, and built for a kind of war that no longer existed. Her equipment was outdated, her wooden flight deck worn thin. She was a veteran in a world that had moved on. By 1949, the proposals for preservation had stalled. The letters stopped coming. One by one, the committees disbanded. The Navy quietly reclassified her as out of commission, in reserve. Her hull number, CV-6, remained on paper, but the ship herself was fading into bureaucratic limbo. The irony was cruel. The most decorated ship of the Second World War, the only carrier to fight from the first day of America's involvement to the last, was now too valuable to scrap, yet too costly to save. For years she sat moored at Bremerton, Washington, her decks covered in tarpaulins, her interior stripped of equipment. Rainwater pooled in her hangars, pigeons nested in her rafters. Veterans visiting the yard would stop at her gangway, salute quietly, and leave without words. The men who had once called her home began to age. Some became teachers, mechanics, postmen, farmers. They carried fragments of the ship with them: a pocket compass, a photo from the flight deck, a piece of teakwood polished smooth. When they met at reunions, the talk always turned back to her, to the smell of aviation fuel, the roar of engines, the way she would tremble just before a full launch. To them, the Enterprise was not just a ship. She was a living memory of who they had been when the world was on fire. Then, in 1958, came the final order. The Navy had decided Enterprise, CV-6, would be sold for scrap. The announcement passed quietly through the veteran community like a death notice. Newspapers carried small articles: famed carrier to be broken up. No ceremonies, no speeches, just the administrative end of a legend. When the scrapping began in 1959, the workers approached her as they would any other ship. But many soon realized this was different. Some of them had fought in the war themselves. Cutting torches bit into the steel of her hull, sending sparks into the air like embers from a funeral pyre. Plates fell into the water with deep, hollow sounds. One worker wrote later, "It was like dismantling a cathedral. Every beam had history in it." Piece by piece, she vanished. The flight deck that had launched thousands of aircraft was disassembled plank by plank. The island was lifted away. The great hull was reduced to fragments of steel loaded onto barges. By 1960, nothing remained but the ghost of her outline on the empty pier. And yet, she did not die. Not really. Her name survived, spoken with reverence in naval academies, printed in textbooks, carved into memorial plaques. The Navy could not forget her, nor could the enemy that had once tried so desperately to destroy her. In Japan, naval officers writing their memoirs mentioned her with a kind of reluctant awe. One Japanese admiral called her the persistent one, saying, "Every time we thought her gone, she returned. She was like the war itself, always coming back." In 1961, a new name appeared on the hull of a ship under construction at Newport News. It read, Enterprise, CV-65. Nuclear-powered, massive, and gleaming white, she represented a new age of warfare, an age that would last generations beyond the men of the Big E. When the old veterans heard of her launch, many smiled quietly. To them, the name was a promise kept. The spirit of the ship that had refused to die would sail again. But even as a new Enterprise carried jet aircraft across the oceans of the Cold War, the original lingered in memory. Historians began to call her the most haunted ship that ever lived. Not because of ghosts, but because her story seemed to echo through every carrier that followed. Her battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, Okinawa, became case studies in survival and adaptation. Her name appeared in every manual on naval aviation, every documentary, every classroom where the Pacific War was taught. In the decades that followed, artifacts from her wrecking were scattered across the country. A section of her hangar deck became part of a museum exhibit. Her bell was placed at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, where it still rings on ceremonial occasions. Small pieces of her armor were turned into plaques and keepsakes. None of it was enough to replace the ship herself, but each fragment carried a whisper of what she had been. For those who had served aboard her, memory filled the absence. They would tell their children and grandchildren stories of the ship that could not be sunk, the ship that kept fighting when logic said she should not, when the odds were hopeless, when the sea itself seemed to conspire against her. They would describe the way she smelled after battle, the eerie quiet that fell just before dawn launches, the sound of her engines starting again after being pronounced dead. To outsiders, those stories sounded exaggerated, like legends told too many times. But to the men who had been there, every detail was real. The Big E had been more than iron and engines. She had been the sum of their endurance, the vessel of their will. In time, the Navy would honor her with a new distinction. In 1985, Enterprise CV-6 was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, decades after the war, in acknowledgement of the battles that had already become myth. Her record stood unmatched: 20 battle stars, participation in nearly every major naval engagement of the Pacific War, and more enemy ships sunk or damaged than any vessel in history. For historians, she became a study in resilience. For sailors, she remained a legend. And for the few who had touched her steel, who had walked her decks while the world burned around them, she was something simpler, something sacred. Home. Even today, long after her last plate was melted down, the name Enterprise carries an echo of that era, a reminder that victory was not built on invincibility but on endurance. The ship Japan could not sink was not invulnerable. She bled, burned, and broke like any other. What set her apart was that she never stayed down. Her story is not one of triumph alone, but of persistence in the face of annihilation, of men who refused to surrender, and of a ship that seemed to draw breath from their defiance. In the end, her legacy was not measured in the tons of steel she displaced or the planes she launched, but in the quiet conviction she left behind. That survival, too, can be a form of victory. For decades after the guns fell silent, the name Enterprise lingered like an echo across two nations that had once fought to the edge of extinction. In America, it was a name wrapped in pride, a symbol of endurance, of impossible survival. In Japan, it carried a different weight, the reminder of an enemy that would not die, a ship that seemed to rise from its own ruins again and again. When the old officers of the Imperial Navy met in Tokyo after the war, they spoke of her with the uneasy respect one gives to a worthy adversary. They remembered her silhouette, long, low, dark against the sea, and the way her aircraft always seemed to find their targets no matter how the fleets maneuvered. They called her the Black Shadow. One admiral admitted that he had reported her sunk 3 separate times. Each time, he said, she returned to haunt us. In the years that followed, Japanese historians studying the Pacific War found themselves writing about Enterprise as though she were a character, not a ship. She became a recurring presence in memoirs and tactical analyses, a constant reminder of the carrier war's brutal balance between chance and endurance. The Japanese pilots who had faced her often described her not in technical terms, but in emotional ones. "We felt she had a soul," one recalled. "You could kill 100 of her planes, but she would send 100 more." To the Americans who had served aboard her, such words seemed strange, yet not entirely wrong. They too had felt that the Big E possessed something beyond machinery, a will to survive. It was an illusion, of course, born from discipline, training, and the fierce loyalty of her crew. But in the memory of those who lived through those years, it became more than illusion. It became the truth. By the 1950s, the story of Enterprise had entered textbooks and documentaries. Her battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, Okinawa, were studied not just as history, but as symbols of turning points. Film reels from wartime newsreels showed her launching aircraft, smoke curling from her deck, sailors running to battle stations. The narration always used the same tone, reverent. Measured, almost religious. In small towns across America, her veterans gathered in Legion halls and community centers. They brought faded photographs, fragments of uniforms, yellowed flight logs. When they spoke of the ship, their voices softened. They remembered the endless noise of the engines, the smell of aviation fuel in the morning, the cold spray on the flight deck before dawn. Some remembered the silence that followed battle, the absence of sound more terrifying than the fight itself. And yet, despite the nostalgia, there was always an undercurrent of loss. They had expected her to be preserved, to stand as a museum where future generations could walk her decks. When she was cut apart for scrap, many felt betrayed. "We lost her twice," one sailor wrote. "First to the war, then to forgetfulness." But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. The legend of Enterprise began to reassert itself, not through monuments, but through memory. Writers and filmmakers rediscovered her story in archives, letters, and logbooks. Naval cadets studied her campaigns as examples of tactical adaptation under impossible pressure. In classrooms and documentaries, her survival became shorthand for the resilience of the American fleet itself. The irony was that, for all her fame, few Americans ever saw her in person. She existed mostly in photographs, grainy black and white images of a gray carrier cutting through open water, her deck crowded with planes, her island shrouded in smoke. To the post-war generation, she became less a machine and more a metaphor, a representation of a time when the outcome of the world had rested on a handful of ships and the men who sailed them. Across the Pacific, her name endured in a different register. For Japanese naval historians, Enterprise symbolized the changing face of warfare. She represented the triumph of air power over battleship doctrine, the lesson that Japan had learned too late. In post-war lectures at the Naval Academy in Etajima, instructors spoke of her strikes at Midway as the decisive moment that sealed Japan's fate. "The enemy who struck from the clouds," one lecturer wrote, "had no single weakness we could exploit. Enterprise was the face of the new war." Matt. As the decades passed, survivors from both sides began to meet. Pilots who had fought above the same patch of ocean, gunners who had once tried to kill each other. When they spoke, they found that memory softened old hatred. At one reunion in the 1970s, a Japanese veteran who had flown against Enterprise shook hands with one of her former air officers. "We did our duty," he said quietly, "but your ship, she was stronger than duty." The American simply nodded. He understood. The story of Enterprise also became a reflection of something larger, the endurance of democracy under pressure, the belief that resilience could outlast aggression. Politicians invoked her name in speeches. Presidents visited naval yards and referenced her in metaphors of strength and perseverance. The ship Japan couldn't sink became more than a phrase. It became a cultural shorthand for surviving the impossible. And yet, beneath the myth, there was always the reality. Thousands of men who had fought, suffered, and died to keep her afloat. The Big E had not been invincible. She had simply refused to surrender. Her survival had cost lives. Engineers burned alive in the hangars, gunners blown overboard, pilots lost in the sea. Every patch on her hull, every scar in her plating had been paid for in blood. The legend of unsinkability was, in truth, a story of endurance through grief. Even today, historians studying the Pacific War often pause when they reach her name. The archival documents, after-action reports, deck logs, intelligence summaries, cannot fully convey what she meant to those who served on her or fought against her. The numbers tell only part of it. 20 battle stars, 18 major engagements, over 400 enemy aircraft destroyed. But the rest lies in the tone of the reports themselves, in the phrases that recur again and again. Severe damage sustained, ship remained in action. The Japanese records mirror that same disbelief. After every battle, their reports listed American carriers believed destroyed. Each time, Enterprise appeared again, her air groups striking new targets. A psychological burden grew around her name, a kind of collective dread. "We began to think she could not be killed," wrote one Japanese officer after the war. "It seemed that our bombs passed through her without effect." Perhaps that was her true weapon, the illusion of immortality. For the enemy, she represented inevitability. For her own men, she represented faith. Between those two perceptions lay the strange alchemy that makes legends endure. By the 1980s, the last of her veterans were growing old. Many visited museums that displayed fragments of her steel, touching them with the quiet reverence one gives to relics. Some brought their grandchildren, explaining in simple words what the war had been like, what she had meant. They would say, "She always came back." That was enough. Her story bridged generations, moving from memory into myth, from fact into symbol. The ship Japan could not sink became a mirror for everything the war had revealed about human endurance, the capacity to adapt, to fight on, to rebuild. In that way, the Big E never truly left the sea. In the years that followed her dismantling, the absence of the Enterprise became almost as powerful as her presence had been. For the United States Navy, she was a ghost that hovered over every new class of carrier, a silent benchmark for courage, endurance, and the burden of command. Every new captain knew her name. Every midshipman learned her battles. In the Navy's collective memory, the Big E was not just a ship. She was the standard against which all others would be measured. When the new USS Enterprise, CV-65, was commissioned in 1961, she carried more than a name. She carried a legacy. The world had changed. The enemy was no longer a fleet on the horizon, but the threat of annihilation from the sky. Yet even in that nuclear age, the echo of the first Enterprise lingered. Her name, carved in the steel of the new carrier's bow, felt like a continuation, a refusal to let the past sink beneath the waves. At her launching ceremony, a handful of gray-haired veterans of the original CV-6 stood among the guests. They watched the towering shape of the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier slide into the water. The band played the same march that had once welcomed the Big E home to Pearl Harbor. One of the old men removed his cap and whispered to another, "She's back." The new Enterprise was a machine of a different era. 8 nuclear reactors, a crew of more than 4,000, aircraft capable of striking across continents. But in her wardrooms and on her flight deck, the spirit of the original was kept alive. Pilots spoke of the name with reverence. Sailors decorated their lockers with old photographs of CV-6. Her legend became a kind of inheritance. When storms battered the tow, carrier groups in the Atlantic or Arabian Sea, someone would inevitably say, "The Big E never quit. Neither do we." The shadow of that endurance extended far beyond the Navy. In the culture of post-war America, Enterprise became shorthand for audacity, exploration, and resilience. When the space race began, NASA engineers chose the name for one of the first prototype space shuttles. The gesture was deliberate, a tribute to a vessel that had defined the 20th century's greatest test of survival. When the Shuttle Enterprise rolled out in 1976, veterans of the original ship were invited to the ceremony. They stood on the tarmac as the new machine, a craft designed to leave the planet altogether, was christened with their ship's name. The crowd cheered, and for a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself, the wooden decks of 1942 blending with the steel and composites of the space age. A name that had once terrified Japan now pointed toward the stars. But the influence of the Big E was not only symbolic. In the decades after World War II, her lessons shaped every element of carrier warfare. The Navy's new doctrines, distributed strike capability, flexible task forces, integrated air defense, all traced their lineage back to the improvisations born on Enterprise's deck. Her battles had rewritten naval theory in real time. Midway taught the value of surprise. Santa Cruz taught endurance under pressure. Okinawa taught the limits of human and mechanical resilience. Each engagement had left behind data, decisions, and precedents that became the foundation of modern naval aviation. Naval architects studied her damage reports as sacred texts. The way her hull had flexed under torpedo impact, the way her compartmentalization had contained fire, the way her flight deck crews had restored operations under combat, all became reference points in the design of the next generations of carriers. Even her flaws became lessons. Her wooden deck, once a vulnerability, led directly to the adoption of armored steel decks in post-war designs. Her limited elevator capacity inspired the angled deck concept that would revolutionize jet operations in the 1950s. In that sense, the Enterprise never truly stopped influencing the Navy. She evolved silently through every carrier that bore her lessons in their design. Meanwhile, in Japan, her legend took on a different tone. In museums and war memorials, her image appeared in photographs and models, sometimes as the adversary, sometimes as a symbol of fate. For Japanese naval officers studying at new academies under the banner of the post-war self-defense forces, she was not an enemy but a teacher. Her story illustrated the cost of underestimating innovation, the danger of clinging to doctrine. In classrooms in Etajima, instructors would gesture to a diagram of her flight operations at Midway and say, "Here is where we lost the Pacific." The old animosities faded into respect. The name Enterprise became a kind of common language, a shared reference for both sides of the Pacific, a reminder of how war had transformed them both. When Japanese destroyers later joined American carrier groups on joint exercises, the name surfaced again, spoken not in fear, but in familiarity. History had completed its long arc from conflict to cooperation. At home, in the United States, the memory of the Big E filtered into literature, art, and film. Documentaries revisited her battles with grainy footage and solemn narration. Books described her as the fighting heart of the Pacific. Her story appeared in classrooms, her image on postage stamps. Generations who had never known war grew up hearing of her as the ship that refused to die. And yet, for all the reverence, her story remained curiously understated. There was no grand monument, no towering memorial in Washington. Her memory lived instead in smaller gestures: a bell rung on anniversaries, a plaque in a naval chapel, a model ship in a classroom. The absence of grandeur suited her legend. Enterprise had never been about spectacle. She had been about persistence, about continuing to fight when everything else had failed. In the quiet halls of the Naval Academy, her name still carried a weight that could silence conversation. Cadets passing her bell sometimes paused, listening to the faint echo it made against the stone walls. For them, it was more than tradition. It was a call to live up to an impossible example. By the late 20th century, when the Cold War reached its most dangerous peaks, the Navy looked to her legacy again. In strategy papers and war games, planners invoked the spirit of Enterprise as shorthand for flexibility under fire. Her story was cited in motivational briefings, her photograph hung in ready rooms. The message was clear: ships may change, technology may evolve, but the essence of survival remains the same. For those who studied her history closely, one lesson stood out above all others. The Enterprise had never won because she was indestructible. She had won because she adapted faster than she was broken. Every battle forced her to evolve: new tactics, new systems, new courage. That principle became the DNA of the modern Navy and, by extension, of American power at sea. Even as the world entered the digital age, the name retained its aura. Sailors who had never known the sound of propeller engines still referred to the spirit of the Big E. When the nuclear-powered Enterprise, CV-65, was finally decommissioned in 2017, her crew gathered for one last formation. Many of them carried patches or insignia bearing the number SIL, a nod to the original. During the ceremony, an admiral spoke. Words that bridged 75 years of history. The Enterprise is not a ship. She is an idea, one we never let go. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, from Midway to the edge of space, the name had transcended time. The ship Japan could not sink had become something elemental, a symbol of endurance in a century defined by uncertainty. History has a way of choosing its own storytellers. For the USS Enterprise, they were not the admirals or politicians who had signed her orders, but the sailors and airmen who had once touched her steel, the journalists who filmed her deck through drifting smoke, and the generations of filmmakers and writers who tried to capture what could never be entirely put into words, the feeling of a ship that refused to die. In the decades after the war, as film reels were restored and archives declassified, her legend resurfaced not as a tale of conquest, but of survival. Documentaries narrated in steady, reverent tones showed grainy footage of her deck crews running into fire, of her pilots returning in planes half destroyed, of the gray hull limping through the Pacific under her own power. The images spoke for themselves. They carried no triumphalism, only endurance. Audiences watched, and they saw something that felt different from other war stories. The Big E's narrative was not about glory, it was about persistence in the face of annihilation. In a century defined by destruction, that message resonated. By the 1960s and 1970s, her name appeared in novels, television, even in popular culture far beyond the Navy. It became a symbol of exploration, of courage in the unknown. When a new science fiction series sought a name for its starship, a vessel meant to carry humanity beyond the stars, it borrowed hers. And so, the name Enterprise entered a new mythology, not of war, but of imagination. The association was not accidental. To millions of viewers who had never seen the ocean, Enterprise meant endurance, progress, and the refusal to surrender to fear. For the aging veterans of CV-6, the irony was bittersweet. They saw the name reborn in fiction, sailing among stars rather than waves, and yet they knew that the true ship, their ship, had been real and had carried them through nights darker than any screen could capture. When journalists interviewed them about the connection, they smiled quietly and said, "She deserves to fly forever." At the same time, historians began to re-examine her from new angles. They combed through deck logs, after-action reports, and combat footage, searching not just for facts but for understanding. What made her so resilient? Was it her construction, her leadership, her luck, or something less tangible, a morale that turned machinery into will? The answer, they found, lay in the margins of the records, in handwritten notes, in the way officers described her as though she were alive. Reports used words like wounded, recovered, and fought on. These were not metaphors chosen lightly. They revealed how her crew had come to see her as one of them. Museums across the United States began collecting artifacts from her remains. A section of her flight deck was preserved at the Smithsonian, still scorched by battle. The ship's bell hung at the Naval Academy, where it was rung on ceremonial days. Veterans' families donated uniforms, logbooks, and fragments of metal. Each item carried the same quiet weight, proof that she had been real. Visitors who saw those relics often found themselves speaking softly, as though in a cathedral. Children stared at photographs of young men crowded on her deck, grinning despite the smoke curling behind them. Few could imagine that the world had once depended on such fragile courage. In small ways, her presence lingered everywhere. Naval air squadrons named their mess halls after her. Cadets wrote essays about her tactics. Model builders shaped her in miniature. Filmmakers returned to her story again and again, drawn to the paradox of a ship that had seemed to outlast fate itself. Each retelling added another layer to the legend. But memory, like the sea, changes with time. The closer the world moved toward peace, the more distant her reality seemed. For younger generations, the Enterprise became a myth of a simpler war, one that existed in black and white footage, detached from the moral and human complexity of the conflict itself. Veterans tried to correct that image. They spoke at schools and on television interviews, reminding audiences that every victory had come at a price. "She wasn't lucky," one former crewman said in an interview. "She just had men who refused to quit." By the 1980s, as the Cold War cast its long shadow, the Big E's story found new resonance. To a world living under the threat of nuclear war, her endurance became a metaphor for survival itself. The idea that even when the world seems poised for destruction, something enduring can still hold the line. Books revisited her with a kind of secular reverence. One historian wrote, "She represents the finest paradox of the 20th century. that humanity can create engines of war capable of destruction beyond comprehension, and yet within them find acts of courage that redeem us. In Japan, too, her story continued to ripple through the collective memory. Television documentaries featured interviews with aging Japanese pilots who had faced her over the Solomons and the Marianas. Many spoke without bitterness. They remembered her as a formidable opponent, but also as the vessel that marked the moment their empire met its limits. "We saw her burning," one said softly, "and thought we had won. Then she came back, and we understood that the war was already lost." Across both nations, the image of the Enterprise came to embody something more universal than victory or defeat. She became a symbol of endurance under impossible conditions, a reminder that technology is only as strong as the will behind it. As time moved forward, reunions grew smaller. The veterans' hair turned white, their stories shorter. At each gathering, fewer chairs were filled. They toasted to the Big E and to absent friends, their voices trembling slightly as they sang the old Navy hymns. When they spoke of her, it was no longer in the language of battle, but of gratitude. She had carried them home, and in that way, the myth of the unsinkable ship became something gentler, not a tale of steel and fire, but of memory and belonging. The Enterprise, the ship Japan could not sink, had become part of the quiet landscape of remembrance, a vessel that had once fought across the largest ocean on Earth and now sailed only through stories, photographs, and dreams. The ocean forgets nothing, and neither does history. Somewhere beneath the waves she once ruled, her memory still moves with the tides, invisible but enduring. The men who kept her alive are gone, but their ship remains, floating not on water, but in time itself. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world that the Enterprise had known was gone. The Pacific she had fought across was now threaded with trade routes and fiber-optic cables. The nations that had once sent fleets against one another were economic partners, their warships now sailing side by side in joint exercises. Yet across every ocean, the name of the Big E still carried a quiet gravity. The men who had served aboard her were fading into history. Their numbers dwindled each year, but the stories they left behind had begun to fuse into something larger than memory. Museums held her fragments, libraries her words, but her true remains were the lessons she had taught, the endurance, the precision, the discipline that had turned survival into strategy. Every new generation of sailors inherited a piece of that ethos. When recruits lined up on the decks of modern carriers, their instructors spoke her name as a kind of invocation. Enterprise had become less a vessel than an ideal, a reminder that ships do not endure because of armor or design, but because the people within them refuse to yield. In the quiet archives of Annapolis, researchers studying her logs found notes written in pencil, notations of exhaustion, courage, humor. One line read simply, "Still afloat." That phrase, written in 1942 in a cramped hand, could have served as her epitaph. Through every trial, through the smoke and chaos, that had been her truth. Her influence continued to ripple outward. The naval doctrines she had shaped remained the foundation of modern carrier warfare. The angled decks, the emergency firefighting systems, the flight deck protocols, all of it owed something to the lessons bought with her scars. Even her failures had become teachings. The systems that had broken under stress on her decks were rebuilt stronger on the next generation of carriers. In that sense, the Big E's body was gone, but her DNA ran through the steel of every ship that followed. When the nuclear-powered Enterprise, CVN-65, was retired in 2017, the ceremony was steeped in that awareness. Sailors from across decades gathered on her flight deck. The flags hung motionless in the cold Atlantic air as the Admiral spoke. He read from the records of CV-6, his voice carrying the words across time. "The Enterprise has been pronounced dead many times. She has never failed to rise again. Yet." Among the crowd were descendants of men who had served on the original ship. Some wore medals their fathers or grandfathers had earned in battles fought before they were born. When the band played Anchors Aweigh, a few of them looked out over the water, and for a moment they could almost see her there. The older Enterprise, gray against the horizon, her deck asea with motion. After the ceremony, the Navy made an announcement. A new carrier, still in its earliest stages of construction, would bear her name, USS Enterprise, CVN-80. The crowd erupted in applause. For many, it felt like a circle closing. The name that had refused to die would sail again. In that moment, the myth became tangible once more. Engineers in shipyards began welding her name into steel. Somewhere deep within the hull of the future Enterprise, a small plaque was placed bearing a line from her predecessor's logbook. Enterprise, still afloat. The idea of the unsinkable ship had entered the language of endurance. Journalists used it to describe nations, economies, even human spirit itself. To be like the Enterprise meant to endure when logic said one should fall. In this way, she transcended even her own history, moving from the realm of war into the vocabulary of perseverance. But behind the symbolism lay something deeper, an understanding that her survival had never been inevitable. She had lived because ordinary men, confronted by terror and chaos, had chosen to keep her alive. They had fought fires, patched hulls, dragged wounded comrades through smoke. They had risked themselves for one another, for their ship, for the faint chance that she might last one more hour, one more battle. That act, repeated endlessly across her decks, was the real meaning of the Big E's legend. It was not luck, nor divine favor, nor miracle. It was work, relentless, disciplined, human work. In the years since her passing, historians have tried to define what made the Enterprise unique. Some say it was timing, that she happened to be there at every major turning point of the Pacific War. Others say it was her design, her speed, her durability. But the truest answer lies in what cannot be measured, the collective will of her crew to make her indestructible. Across the Pacific, in Japan, her name still appears in naval studies and in quiet corners of museums. Visitors look at photographs of her under attack, her deck wreathed in smoke, her guns firing into the sky, and read the captions written in restrained, formal Japanese. The American carrier Enterprise, heavily damaged, yet remained in action. For those who look closely, there is admiration in those words, not bitterness. Time has softened the edges of history. The ship that once symbolized the enemy's might has become an emblem of respect, for courage, for resilience, for the shared burden of those who go to sea. In America, schoolchildren visiting naval museums still pause before her artifacts. They read the placards and try to imagine what it meant to live aboard her. Most cannot grasp it. The world they inhabit is too distant from the ocean she knew. Yet even they understand something of what her name means. When they hear Enterprise, they hear persistence, they hear survival. In the end, every generation rebuilds her in its own way. For some, she is a chapter in a history book. For others, a symbol of national endurance. For a few, she remains a memory. The feel of the deck beneath their boots, the salt spray on their faces, the endless sound of engines in the dark. The Big E never asked to become a legend. She was built for war, not remembrance. Yet legends are not chosen. They are forged in fire, in chaos, in the narrow space between disaster and salvation. And so she endures, not because she could not be sunk, but because the story of her survival refuses to fade. Somewhere in the rhythm of the waves, in the whistle of wind across steel, her name is still spoken, not as nostalgia, but as promise. The promise that no storm lasts forever, that courage, once proven, does not vanish, that even when the sea closes over the past, something remains afloat. The sea is indifferent. It remembers everything and forgives nothing. It erases empires, consumes ships, and buries names beneath waves. Yet somehow, against all logic, one name endures above its surface. Enterprise. Long after her hull was melted down, after the last of her crew faded into history, her story still moves with the tides. It surfaces whenever courage is tested, whenever men and women face the impossible and refuse to break. The Big E has become more than the sum of her battles. She is the language through which endurance is remembered. To those who fought aboard her, she was never a monument. She was noise and heat and motion, a living thing that breathed through their effort. The clang of the hangar deck, the vibration of engines at flank speed, the shout of orders through smoke, these were the sounds of her heartbeat. When the bombs fell, when the deck split open, when fire clawed its way toward the magazines, she stayed alive, because they did. The ship's will was their own. Every sailor who served on her carried some fragment of that bond into the rest of his life. In quiet moments, at workbenches, in offices, in fields, they would sometimes stop and feel, somewhere deep within, the steady rhythm of those engines still turning. For them, she was not a story. She was memory made permanent. The war she had fought was the largest the world had ever seen, yet her story remained intensely human. She was not invincible. She burned, she bled, she broke. She lost men, hundreds of them, whose names are carved now in cold stone. But she always came back, and in that persistence lay her greatness. Victory had not made her immortal. Endurance had. In Japan, too, her name lingers. In the naval museums at Kure and Yokosuka, visitors stand before black and white photographs of her at Midway, at Santa Cruz, at Okinawa. They read captions written without flourish. The American carrier Enterprise, damaged but returned to battle. For a moment, the distance between enemy and opponent dissolves. What remains is recognition, of courage, of loss, of the shared endurance of those who go to sea and never know if they will return. In America, her story is retold each generation in new forms: films, books, documentaries, museum exhibits. Yet the essence remains unchanged. The image of her silhouette against a burning horizon still captures something primal, the human refusal to yield. When the next Enterprise, CVN-80, takes her place in the fleet, her name will pass once more from myth into motion. New sailors will walk her decks, unaware at first of the weight they carry. But in time, they will understand. They will feel it when they stand at the rail at night, staring into the black water, hearing only the wind and the slow pulse of the engines. They will know that they are part of something older than themselves, something that has crossed generations and oceans, surviving every attempt to erase it. Because Enterprise is not just a name, it is a continuity of spirit, the belief that no matter how many times the world seems to burn, someone will always keep the ship alive. If one listens closely, even now, the sea itself seems to echo her story. Not in words, but in rhythm. The crash of waves against invisible hulls, the distant roll of thunder that sounds like guns over water. In that endless motion lies her immortality. The ship that Japan could not sink has become part of the ocean's memory. She began as a machine of war and ended as a symbol of endurance. Her steel is gone, but her idea remains, an idea written in every logbook she filled, every plane she launched, every life she carried home. When the lights go down in museums, when the last veterans are gone, when the world forgets the details of her battles, she will still exist. In the simple truth she proved again and again, that courage can outlast destruction. That faith can outlast fear. That some things, once forged in fire, never truly sink, and so the Big E sails on, through time, through memory, through every ocean that has ever known her name, still afloat, forever.